Welcome to Sweet Tea with the Classics, the podcast that takes classic literature and gives it a southern twist.
Britomart and Amoret, FAERIE QUEENE, Book 3, Cantos 10 and 12. After Britomart and Glasgow left the palace of King Rents, many adventures befell them. In all her adventures, Britomart's magic sword and matchless prowess gained for her great renown, and she was spoken of far and wide as the Knight of the Theban Spear, while old Glasgow, her nurse, was believed to be her squire. They encountered many a famous knight, but they had not yet found him whom they sought. One day, as they were continuing in their search, they came suddenly upon a stranger knight, who lay with his face on the ground, his armor scattered near him, and who seemed either asleep or in great distress. Lest he should be sleeping, Britomart did not speak, but stood waiting patiently. Presently the knight groaned, as if his very heart were breaking, then burst forth into piteous wail over the loss of Amoret, his wife. Unconscious that he was heard, the knight cried out against the cruelty of the wicked enchanter who had taken her prisoner, and kept her for the last 7 months cruelly tormented, and shut out from the light of day, in a stronghold guarded by thick smoke and magic fires. Then followed such an outburst of grief that Britomart thought his very life in danger, and no longer able to forbear, stooped down and spoke to him. At the sound of her voice, the knight raised himself and looked up, but seeing a stranger, he hastily flung himself down, angry at being disturbed. Britomart, however, was not to be easily daunted, and again spoke. "Ah, gentle knight," she exclaimed, "whose griefs seem well nigh past bearing, scorn not the relief which Providence may send you. To my hand it may be given to relieve your woe, and wreak vengeance on your enemy." Her brave words so touched the knight's heart that he poured out the whole bitterness of his woe, telling her how hard it was to reach Amoret, since the tyrant had her in strong enchantment, and had guarded her dungeons with dreadful fiends. Britomart was greatly moved by his sad tale, and again offered her aid. "Sir knight," she said, "if you will listen to me, I will either deliver her to you from thence, or die with her." At first the knight, whose name was Scudamore, would not accept so great a boon, but Britomart at length succeeded in persuading him to arise and accompany her to the scene of Amoret's captivity. Arrived at the tyrant's stronghold, they dismounted and went boldly to its entrance. There they found neither gate nor porter, but a porch from which issued flames of fire, mingled with smoke and sulphurous stench. At this Britomart was greatly dismayed, and turning to Scudamore, consulted him how best to overcome this dreadful obstacle. "For," said she, "to run into danger without care and thought is worthy only of the beasts." "Alas," said Scudamore, "this is the worst cause of my distress, for the fire cannot be quenched by any wit or skill. What then is there left to me but ceaseless sorrowing? Leave me to my grief. Let Amoret dwell in chains, and Scudamore die of misery." "Nay, to abandon a brave deed for the mere show of danger were a shameful thing. Better run all risks than turn aside for fear." Thereupon, resolved to trust her weapon to the utmost, Britomart threw her great shield before her face, and pointing her magic sword straight in front, moved onward, when lo! the dread flames parted on either side of her, and she passed through scatheless. When Scudamore saw that she had passed beyond the fire and was uninjured, he too tried to force a way, but he was full of proud passions, and commanded the flames to yield to him, and being foolish enough to threaten them, increased their mighty rage, so that with imperious sway they sent him back, scorched and burned. Impatience and disappointment raged in his bosom, and in a very madness of misery he again flung himself on the ground, and beat his head and breast, and would take neither hope nor comfort. Meantime Britomart pursued her way, and going through the first door, entered an outer chamber. It was full of precious stores, and was hung round with rich arrays, into which was woven many a fair scene, portraying the feats of Cupid, the blind god. At the upper end of the chamber stood an altar, built of gems of great beauty, and on the altar was an image of massive gold with wings of diverse colors, more varied and brilliant than the hues of the rainbow. This image represented Cupid with the fatal bow and arrows in his hand, and at his feet a wounded dragon. Underneath were written these words, "Unto the victor of the gods this be." and all the people that dwelt in the great castle paid it homage. Britomart stood still for a while, gazing at the golden image, fascinated by its brightness, but at length she turned to look back and take in the other wonders of the chamber. Then, for the first time, she noticed the words, "Be bold," written over a doorway. She puzzled over their meaning for some time, and could not find it, but no way dismayed by the apparent warning, she followed their advice and advanced from the first to a second chamber. This chamber was still richer than the other. Its walls were overlaid with gold wrought with figures of antique story, and all about were the spoils and arms and trophies of mighty conquerors who had been taken captive by the cruel Cupid. For a time Britomart gazed around her, and the more she looked, the more she wondered, both at the richness of the room and at the wasteful emptiness and solemn silence that pervaded the place. As she continued her survey, she saw over the door through which she had just passed the same words, 3 times written, "Be bold." While trying to make out their import, her eyes chanced to light upon an iron door at the other end of the room, on which was written, "Be not too bold." This puzzled her still more, but no living creature appeared from whom she could ask an explanation, and now the shadows lengthened and darkness fell. Yet Britomart would not sleep, but sat in watchfulness, her armor on, and her weapons all about her. When night had quite set in, she was startled by the shrill sound of a trumpet. After the trumpet blast, there arose a hideous storm of wind with thunder, lightning, and an earthquake, followed by a horrible stench of sulphur and smoke, which lasted from 4 in the morning until 6. Yet Britomart remained steadfast in her watch. Then suddenly arose a whirlwind, throwing open the heavy iron door, and from an inner room there entered a grave personage, bearing a branch of laurel, and clad as if for the tragic stage. Before Britomart had time to recover from the surprise of this apparition, a band of minstrels, followed by a troop of maskers, issued from the chamber. Sweet music and strange gay figures now filled the hitherto empty room. They were Fancy and Desire, dressed in silk and embroidery, Doubt and Danger in more sombre garb, Fear armed from head to foot, Hope with golden locks and samite robes, Suspicion and Deceit, Grief and Fury, Pleasure and Displeasure, 6 couples in all. Behind these came a fair lady, led by Cruelty and Despite, who goaded and tormented her as she walked. After these rode the winged god, mounted on a lion, and closely followed by Reproach, Shame, and Repentance, while a confused rabble brought up the rear. The procession marched 3 times round the chamber, and disappeared into the inner room. As soon as it had passed through, the iron door was violently closed by the same whirlwind which had opened it, and then Britomart came forth from the shady corner in which she had stood unnoticed, and tried to follow, but she could by no means pass the door, and was obliged to wait patiently for any opportunity that might arise. All day the maiden waited, and when the next night came with its garment of darkness, her hopes rose, and not in vain. By the second watch the door flew open, and afraid neither of masks nor enchantments, Britomart walked boldly in. As soon as she entered, she looked around for the persons whom she had seen the previous night. But of all the motley crew, only one was visible, and this was the fair lady, who had been led by the cruel villains, and who indeed was Amoret. Her hands were fast bound, and round her waist was an iron band that fastened her to a brass pillar. Before her was the wicked enchanter, drawing strange characters with Amoret's own heart's blood, which he drew from her by means of a cruel transfixed dart. By such strange spells he sought to charm her into loving him, but he had already tried 1,000 charms, and had utterly failed to touch her love and loyalty to Scudamore, and indeed she was little likely to love one who wrought such cruel imprisonment. The moment the enchanter saw Britomart in her knightly attire, he cast away his books of wicked magic, and drawing a murderous knife from his pocket, ran fiercely at poor Amoret, whom for very spite he was ready to kill rather than see her escape. Britomart leapt forward, seized his arm, and stayed his murderous intent. In a moment the enchanter's rage turned upon her, and his sword inflicted a wound upon her snowy throat. Then Britomart drew forth her deadly spear, and struck him so dire a blow that he fell on the ground half dead. Another stroke must have killed him, and she was on the point of dealing it, when Amoret made sign to her to hold her hand, telling Britomart that only he who had enchained could set her free. Hearing this, the noble maiden paused, and very unwilling to spare her wicked captive, addressed him thus: "Thou wretched man, for whom no punishment can be too severe, be sure that nothing shall save thee from death, unless thou immediately restore this lady to health and freedom." Glad to secure his life on any terms, the enchanter at once yielded, and rising up, began to work over the leaves of his accursed books, that he might learn how to reverse the charms he had wrought. Britomart stood over him with her sword drawn, and so dreadful were the things he read that her hair stood on end with horror. By and by she perceived that the house shook and the door rattled, but not for a moment did she slacken the grasp of her weapon. With steadfast eye and stout courage she waited to see what these strange omens meant. At length she saw the chain that wound round the waist of Amoret fall slowly to the ground, and the brazen pillar to which she was bound break in pieces. The dart that pierced her bosom fell out of its own accord. The wound it made had closed up as though it had never existed, and all the hurts and bruises caused by her long imprisonment were forthwith healed. When the fair dame found herself free, she fell on the ground before Britomart, thanking her out of the fullness of her heart, and begging to be permitted to render her deliverer some service or reward. Britomart raised her, and replied courteously that her labor received more than sufficient reward in seeing Amoret thus free and safe. She then besought the lady to take comfort, and putting away the remembrance of her past cruel sufferings, think rather of what Scudamore, her loving husband, had lately endured on her account. It cheered and comforted Amoret to hear Scudamore, whom of all living people she loved best, thus spoken of by her deliverer. But Britomart's work was not yet done. She turned to Busyrand, the wicked enchanter, and bound him firmly by the chain which had held Amoret captive, and thus secured, led him forth from his own stronghold. Then Britomart was amazed to find that the rooms which had so lately astonished her by their beauty and richness had completely vanished. Still more surprised was she to find that the flames which had guarded the porch quenched, and the porch itself gone. But now a sore disappointment befell both Britomart and the lady Amoret. For when they reached the spot where Scudamore had been left, neither he nor Glausy the squire were anywhere to be seen. Britomart's brave heart was sorely astonished, and poor Amoret, in whom hope had sprung up, was filled with alarm and misgiving, lest she had been betrayed. Scudamore's faint-heartedness was the cause of their grief and disappointment. For a time after the warlike maiden's disappearance within the castle, he lay eagerly expecting her return, but she did not come back at all that day, and Scudamore, who was not a very great, and therefore not a very patient knight, gave in to despair, and made up his mind that Britomart had been consumed by the flames. He took counsel with old Glausy, and together they resolved to leave their post and go in search of further help. Thus it was that Britomart and Amoret came forth to find themselves deserted, and so Scudamore and Glausy and Britomart and Amoret sought each other for many a long day in vain. How they met at last, another tale must tell.
Thank you for listening to Sweet Tea with the Classics. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please like, share, and subscribe for more.